Good day. Today is Thursday, 6th February 2025, and well, perhaps there's been a slight slowdown in some of the activities that are happening in Washington, but I suspect that that is more apparent than real, and dribbles of sometimes rather disturbing information continue to float upwards, outwards, informing us of new things or of things that we suspected, but which now turn out to be mostly true. For example, yesterday, reports were circulating in the American media and have apparently been confirmed by the White House that Politico, a magazine that I often quote and cite in the programs on this channel, and which I have frequently said seems to be exceptionally well informed about thinking within the US government. Anyway, there were reports yesterday that Politico has been receiving funding from the US government, ultimately from the US government, perhaps through US aid. And there are suggestions that other media outlets in the United States have been receiving funding in the same way. I'm not going to pretend that I am fully on top of the story, but anyway, there we are. There's also reports which were floating around all over the internet yesterday that USAID had paid certain Hollywood personalities large sums of money, actually very large sums of money, sums in the tens of millions of dollars, to be precise, to attend Ukraine-related functions in Kiev and to lend their support to President Zelensky's government in Kiev. Now, I'm not going to name the individuals whose names are floating around. They're all well-known people, just saying. The reason I'm not doing so is that today there are denials, or what appear to be denials, from one of them, who's claiming that this is all Russian disinformation. I think we will probably find that some people were paid, but anyway, I'm going to wait a little for this story to settle and for the facts to become clear. By the way, if it is true, and I use the word if it is true, then I think the individuals involved should be deeply embarrassed and ashamed of what they did. And in certain cases, I believe that they're rich enough to pay the money back, and I think they should do so. Just saying. Anyway, that's all that we're hearing about USAID. For me personally, the single revelation that has disturbed me most and which has interested me most is that it now appears clear that the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project was not just a project that USAID participated in. This is something that has always been known, but that it was in fact run and operated by people from USAID. Now, I have been reading reports by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project for some time. I remember that they played a key role, for example, in the Panama Papers affair of some years ago, when information was obtained, we won't ask how, from the vaults of a Panamanian law firm, and was published all across the media in the West, including places like The Guardian and Der Spiegel and all of the others, in what was, as far as I could see, a clear attempt to try to prove corruption on the part of President Putin and to support claims that he was secreting money in all sorts of overseas offshore accounts using various proxies to do so. Anyway, there we go. I mean, that was one report that I've read. I've read many other reports by the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. I've always had some doubts and skepticism about what it was. But, well, if it really was, in effect, a kind of next step agency of the US government, ultimately, I suppose, of the State Department, well, that would certainly put many of its activities, cast them in a certain light. As you can tell, I am still choosing my words extremely carefully, though I earnestly hope that the cleanup will finally evolve to the point when that no longer is necessary. Anyway, there we are. So, as I said, all of that still continues, and I'm increasingly reading more and more reports criticizing Elon Musk and Dodge, which are at the forefront of much of this investigation activity and revelations that we are seeing. And I read a long article today in The Guardian, which said that Elon Musk is the real ruler of the United States. Donald Trump is merely his cipher. Musk supposedly controls Trump. Claims which, by the way, I consider completely absurd. Whatever one may think of Donald Trump, I don't believe that he takes his instructions from Elon Musk, or indeed takes his instructions from anyone at all. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about all of those things. And over the course of the last 24 hours, there's been continued outcries and indignation and anger, in this case I think justified anger, about the comments made by President Trump about Gaza, about relocation of people from Gaza, about the redevelopment of Gaza. And, well, I've already made my own strong disagreement with those comments absolutely clear. I do regard them, and I want to make this again also clear, as essentially an attempt to throw a lifeline to Benjamin Netanyahu. I go fully along with Alistair Crook on this. I think Donald Trump wants to keep Netanyahu in post as Prime Minister of Israel. He recognizes how weakened Prime Minister Netanyahu has been as a result of the debacle of the war in Gaza. Trump also wants to preserve the ceasefire in Gaza, and he wants to avoid a conflict, a military conflict with Iran. And in order to do all of these things, to achieve all of those things, he apparently wants to keep Prime Minister Netanyahu in post, whilst simultaneously placing himself, Trump, in a position where he's able to control what Prime Minister Netanyahu can do. And I think this is what this is all about, what all of these comments are all about. This is the theory articulated by Alistair Crook in the program Glenn Deason and I did with him. It has a foundation of fact in that Alistair Crook has discussed Trump's comments with a member of the Israeli cabinet who has confirmed that they were coordinated with Netanyahu's office. And I think this is the ultimate purpose and objective of these comments. And note that Trump's observations about making Gaza some kind of US protectorate, his hints that US troops could be sent to Gaza, well, already we are seeing a rowback. The White House spokesman indicated that there are no plans to send US troops to Gaza, and Pete Hegseth, the new Defense Secretary, went further and said that it would be a very, very long time before any idea of sending troops to Gaza were to form. And I believe that. I don't think that the United States has any intention, Donald Trump has any intention of a military intervention in Gaza, of all places, of getting involved, in other words, in a battle with Hamas, which Israel, after a year of fighting and heavy bombing, has failed to defeat. Just saying. Nonetheless, despite, as I said, what I've said about the fact that I think that these words have a purely tactical purpose, I also believe that they were wrong. I don't think they should have been said. I think they normalize or come close to normalizing ideas which are reprehensible and which should not be normalized. I think that it's entirely proper and normal for political leaders to engage in tactical maneuvers. All political leaders have to do that, and they have to do that constantly and all the time. Some are more skilled at doing it than others, just saying. But there are boundaries, and I think this one crossed those boundaries, and I think that there might be consequences as a result of that. But I discussed all of this at length in yesterday's program, and I don't want to revisit those issues. Now, in the meantime, we've been getting more information about the Trump administration's perspectives on the conflict in Ukraine. And there has apparently been a report on NBC. I haven't read it, but I've seen numerous accounts of it, and I believe that this is basically correct. It says that there is a split within the administration about how to approach the conflict in Ukraine. In fact, we had the same observation from Reuters, that the Trump team are not united about how to handle the conflict in Ukraine at the present time. Now, when I say that there is a division, it needs to be understood that this is a division about means, not aims. The entire Trump administration is apparently united in thinking that the war was a mistake, that its prolongation is not in the interests of the United States, that the United States needs to extricate itself from the conflict and ideally should work to bring the conflict to some kind of negotiated end. The split is on how to do it. On the one hand, on the one side, there is Mike Waltz, the new National Security Advisor, and General Kellogg. And they believe that the way to bring the war to an end is by somehow ramping up pressure on the Russians, trying to get the Russians to make significant concessions which will enable the United States to walk away and to claim that it has achieved some kind of, success in Ukraine, even if that has fallen far short of the regime change objectives that the Biden administration originally had, and its objectives to use the conflict to weaken Russia and to detach Russia from China and all of that kind of thing. But nonetheless, preserve Ukraine, perhaps under its present government, maintain some kind of course, ultimately maybe towards NATO membership, even if this is never realized in practice. Spin all that as some kind of win, and hope that this will be accepted in the United States and by the international community, and perhaps even ultimately by some people in Russia itself, causing problems for President Putin. And the way to do that, according to the Mike Waltz, Keith Kellogg faction, is by ramping up pressure on Russia. And presumably that means more sanctions, more tariffs, more weapons supplies to Ukraine, perhaps more missile strikes on Russian territory, all of that. Now, to me, and I have to say this is simply using the methods of the Biden administration to achieve far less ambitious objectives. The Biden administration wanted to ramp up support for Ukraine, to give Ukraine enormous weapon supplies, to impose punitive sanctions on Russia, because they were trying to use Ukraine, trying to use the conflict in Ukraine, in which the United States was clearly a party, to try to weaken Russia, as the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said, and to hopefully provoke a regime change in Russia, as President Biden himself said in the opening weeks of the war in a speech he made in Poland, and to detach Russia from China, as was debated before the war began in an article by Wes Mitchell in the National Interest, published in August 2021, in which Mr. Wes Mitchell suggested that the United States organize a military and geopolitical defeat of Russia in Ukraine, thereby provoking a crisis in Russia, which would enable the United States to gain control of Russian foreign policy, detaching Russia from its partnership with China. Anyway, all of these grand strategies were going to be achieved through military support for Ukraine and through economic pressure on Russia, overwhelming economic pressure, as was supposed, through sanctions. And of course, none of those objectives has been achieved. The Russian economy continues to grow. In fact, today we've had further news confirming a significant acceleration of the Russian economy in the last weeks of 2024. It seems that industrial production in Russia shot up in December, and it is continuing to grow rapidly in January. We've seen that services in Russia appear to be expanding as well. All of the attempts to crush the Russian economy have failed, and instead of Russia facing a military defeat in Ukraine, virtually everybody, except perhaps President Zelensky and a few other people, now understand that Russia is, well, perhaps not on the brink of victory, military victory in Ukraine, but closing in on it. Well, despite this pattern of failure, because that is what it is, Mike Waltz and Keith Kellogg propose more of the same. More sanctions, more weapons, more pressure on the Russians, not this time to achieve any of the grand strategic objectives that the Biden people had, detaching Russia from China, engineering regime change in Moscow, humiliating Russia, all that, and weakening it permanently so that it can never even consider becoming a great power again. None of that this time. Just to get the Russians to make enough concessions to save America's face, because that's what this all really would amount to. Now, as I've discussed in a number of programs recently, we, that is to say Glenn Deason and myself, did a program last Friday, actually, with Ambassador Polyansky, who is the deputy head of mission of Russia to the United Nations. And rather intentionally and rather mischievously, I said to Ambassador Polyansky over the course of that interview that it did seem to me that one of the objectives that the United States had at the moment, the current administration has at the moment, is to try to extricate from the United States in a way that would save face. And I'm going to suggest that that is exactly what Kellogg and Mike Waltz are basically trying to do. I mean, if you take a step back and ask yourself what the objective is, that clearly is the objective. Anyway, I would invite people to go and watch Ambassador Polyansky's response when I made that point to him. Suffice to say that he made it extremely clear that helping America save face was not a Russian objective or concern in the event that there would be any negotiations. So I can already see fundamental problems with the Mike Waltz, Keith Kellogg approach, which is to pressure the Russians in order to get them to make concessions. They won't be pressured. The United States has exhausted its tools for pressure. All its attempts to do so have failed, and the proposals for further massive sanctions against the Russian oil and gas industry, which have been floating around, whilst they might have some impact on Russia, that impact almost certainly would be muted for reasons I have discussed at great length in many programs, both on this channel and on the Duran, but would undoubtedly have a direct impact on the Western economies, including that of the United States. Almost certainly that type of economic war against Russia now would increase energy prices, leading to higher inflation. Inevitably so. Well, anyway, that's the Waltz. Kellogg approach. Now, Keith Kellogg himself is apparently telling people, again, I haven't seen a definite report that confirms this, but I believe this to be true, that he's now going to unveil his plan at the Munich Security Conference on the 20th of February. In other words, in, 2 weeks' time. So we're 2 weeks into the Trump administration. There's going to be a further 2 weeks beyond that, 24 days in total. And then, but not before, we're going to see finally, or get some idea finally, of what the Kellogg plan amounts to. We've moved very far from the position before the election of ending the war on the very first day. Well, I never took that seriously. But, of course, we've also had comments, suggestions from Kellogg himself that the Americans had a plan to end the war in 100 days from the start of the US, of the new administration. Well, it looks as if after 24 days of those 100 days, in other words, a quarter of that period, will have passed before Kellogg makes a single positive move, which is to unveil this plan. Now, I'm not going to anticipate what this plan is going to be. There's been many ideas and suggestions floating around. It could be based on his April 2024 article, though that has it seems to me, long since now been overtaken by events and was written in a completely different context, the context of a US presidential election, which has now been won. Anyway, it could be that it'll be based on that, or it could be based on other ideas. I think we will have to wait and see. But anyway, he's got 2 weeks. He's given himself another 2 weeks, apparently, to refine it, whatever it is that it amounts to. And then supposedly he's going to go to Kiev, where he's going to present the plan to Zelensky, who of course is his own peace plan. Let's not forget, he's never given up on it. That is the peace plan whereby the Russians withdraw completely from all of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, and then negotiations begin to set up war crimes courts to try Russian officials and Russian officers and perhaps President Putin himself, and also to agree things like the enormous reparations that Russia would have to pay Ukraine. That is Zelensky's peace plan. The Biden administration backed it. So did the NATO. So did NATO and all of the major European powers, Britain, France, Germany. They all lobbied for it in the various Copenhagen process agreements and at the Burgenstock conference in Switzerland last year. They discovered that there were no takers for this plan outside the collective West. Nobody took it seriously. The Russians rejected it outright. But in theory, at least, it is still Zelensky's plan. And of course, he went forward. He went beyond that. In August, he came up with a victory plan, which basically appears to involve giving the Ukrainians even more advanced weapons, Tomahawk missiles, and that kind of thing, and further guarantees and immediate entry into NATO and all of that. And he's now, as I discussed yesterday, talking about Ukraine being provided with nuclear weapons and other types of missiles, and Western militaries positioned on Ukrainian territory. So anyway, we will see how whatever proposals Kellogg comes up with chime or don't chime with Zelensky's ideas, and how Zelensky himself responds to Kellogg's ideas. But anyway, that is the Kellogg Waltz position. You make minimal concessions to the Russians, you pressure the Russians, you try to get the Russians to agree a ceasefire or a freeze or something of that kind, and then you walk away and call that a victory. Except, as I said, I can't understand why the Russians would want to agree to such a thing, and I don't think they will. Anyway, that's one faction, apparently, according to NBC, in Washington, in the administration. The other faction, and I gather that individual members of this faction are not named, take a completely different view. They say that Ukraine is a lost proposition. The United States should never have become involved in the conflict in Ukraine in the first place. The Maidan coup of 2014 was a coup too far, encroaching on Russia's most sensitive security interests. The proposal to bring Ukraine into NATO, floated by George W. Bush and adopted nominally by NATO in 2008, was an absolutely, utterly disastrous idea. Ukraine has clearly lost the war. There is nothing that the United States can do to reverse that outcome. And the best thing for the United States is to cut its losses and let this whole thing go wherever it is going. Leave it in the hands of the Europeans tell the Ukrainians, look, it's up to you now what you do. We can't continue to support you. You can negotiate with the Russians if you wish, but we're not going to become involved. And telling the Europeans, it's also up to you. We, the Americans, have done far more than our fair share. We've provided Ukraine with most of the weapons and most of the money. If you really believe that Ukraine is as important as you say, well, then it is for you in Europe to do your part now and to support Ukraine and to see whether you can achieve the outcome that you want. Now, I gather that NBC does not name any of the people within the administration, those people in the administration who think in that way. Now, one person who is not in the administration, but who clearly does think that way, and who has had a historic connection with Donald Trump, is of course Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon has warned that if Trump continues to support Ukraine, then he will acquire ownership of the war, just as Richard Nixon, by continuing military support for South Vietnam after he was elected president in 1968 and became president in 1969, came to own the Vietnam War, which in fact Lyndon Johnson had started. And Steve Bannon says that if that were to happen, there would be a serious risk that the entire Trump presidency could become consumed with the war, and that this is the trap that Trump and people like him should seek to avoid. So we know that that is a publicly stated view by someone like Steve Bannon. I don't know whether Bannon is in direct contact with Donald Trump, whether they meet or speak on any sort of regular basis. But Bannon is still a significant figure within the wider MAGA movement, and I suspect that he does express a widespread view. But I suspect that there are others closer to the president who think in the same way. I'm going to guess, and I want to stress this is only a guess, that Elon Musk also thinks that. Before he started to support Donald Trump, in the earlier years of the war, Elon Musk repeatedly spoke out against excessive American involvement in the war. He was clearly unhappy at the way in which the Starlink system was being used in the war. He was subjected to significant criticism from the media in Europe and the United States about his comments on ending the war. Nothing that Elon Musk has said or done leads me to think that he has changed his view. And I think that he, and perhaps his friend David Sachs, who also has a role, not, I believe, in the administration itself, but in the wider American government. Anyway, I strongly suspect anyway, that they are amongst the people who hold the opposite view to the one that Waltz and Kellogg do, which is that the best thing that the United States can do is quietly switch off aid to Ukraine and leave it to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans to sort out, so that the United States can focus on other things. Now, saying that, I doubt that Musk and perhaps David Sachs are alone in these views. I wonder, for example, whether the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, perhaps shares them. He has, as I discussed in a recent program, been notably quiet, soft-spoken about the conflict in Ukraine since he became Secretary of State. It's been striking how he's made no strong criticisms of Russia. That could simply be because Rubio is looking forward to negotiations and doesn't want to say things that might offend the Russians and might prevent negotiations. It's possible. But again, it may be that the fact that he's saying very little as he can, as far as I can see, about Ukraine, and has softened significantly the rhetoric against Russia. That might be a sign that he too thinks that really this whole project has gone as far as it can, that it's clearly turning into a debacle, and that the best thing for the United States to do is to walk away from it and perhaps restart a dialogue with the Russians, trying to establish a longer-term relationship between these two nuclear superpowers, Russia and the United States, that will enable the United States to draw down its forces in Europe, which is a priority. It may be, as I said, that there are other people as well. I'm not sure, but I'm going to make a guess that Pete Hegseth as well, now that he's in charge of the Pentagon, he must be concerned about the overextension of US military resources. Everything that I know about Pete Hegseth suggests to me that he too is probably a skeptic about further US military support for Ukraine. And if she's confirmed, I think Tulsi Gabbard might be the same. And, well, Robert Kennedy Jr., if he is confirmed, he definitely, I think, is going to be the same. He's, I think, made his views about the entire Ukrainian conflict perfectly clear in many places and at many times. So we can see that the divisions do exist. And, of course, in the middle of this is the president himself. Now, I am going to say what I think the president's views are, Donald Trump's views. I think at one level, he doesn't want a visible debacle in Ukraine. He doesn't want the United States to face the same kind of visible failure as it was confronted in Afghanistan. But I think all of his instincts, deep down, draw him onto the side of those people who say that cutting back on Ukraine, leaving it to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans, I think all his instincts probably tell him that that is the right way to go. Now, it's important to say that this is Donald Trump's instinct with every one of the long-term wars that the United States has been involved in. He's been a critic of the way in which the Biden administration carried out the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and by the way, a critic with some good cause. It was an extraordinarily chaotic and mismanaged affair. But Donald Trump did make the decision when he was president that the United States should withdraw from Afghanistan. And he did reach agreements with the Taliban, basically to facilitate a US withdrawal. And the word now going out is that Donald Trump has also made a decision to pull US troops out of Syria. Now, he tried to do that when he was president before. He actually gave instructions for US troops to be pulled out of eastern Syria from the Kurdish regions where they still are. He tried to do that on at least 2 occasions. And on the first occasion, he came under enormous pressure and was persuaded to stay, with all sorts of fairy tales about the huge oil wealth supposedly to be found in eastern Syria. A story that, frankly, has been wildly exaggerated. Syria's oil, well, it existed. There was a certain amount of it. It did, during the Assad years, provide a significant funding for the Damascus government. But in terms of the global oil situation, Syria is a very small player, just saying. But anyway, Trump was persuaded to keep the troops in Syria with that particular story. And then later, when he made one final attempt to get the troops out of Syria, in the last weeks of his first presidency, the whole project to evacuate the troops was sabotaged, with American officials subsequently bragging about the fact that they had sabotaged and deceived Trump about the matter, and had even lied to him to his face about how many American troops were actually there in eastern Syria. Well, the word is that this time round, Trump is determined to do it. He's got a Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who almost certainly agrees with him about this issue. Trump is in an immeasurably stronger position than he was at any time in his first term. And it looks as if finally it is going to happen. Just saying. And, well, here we see a further example of Donald Trump making decisions to pull American troops out of harm's way, to reduce America's military footprint, to pursue deals and negotiations, however clumsily and in some occasions preposterously conducted. Though, as I said, preposterous can sometimes be effective and successful. I'm going to reserve judgment on all of that. Let's say, instead of preposterously, unconventionally conducted. That is Donald Trump's instinct. He's pulling troops out of Syria. I don't think he has any intention of deploying them in Gaza. I don't think his instincts tell him. I think his instincts tell him that Ukraine is a losing proposition. Zelensky doesn't have the lithium and the rare earths that he was talking about, and it's time, somehow or other, in some way or other, to call time on that too. So I think Trump, who probably, and I'm guessing as well, probably doesn't think very much about Ukraine, by which I mean I don't think he spends a lot of time debating and thinking about Ukraine. Anyway, I think that over time, especially as the westward advance of the Russians continues, I think over time, Trump will lean more towards the skeptics, because that is his inclination. And I think that over time also, Trump will register the fact that that is what his electorate, the people who voted him president in November, also want to see. So that, I think, is eventually where we're going to go. But in the meantime, we have this conflict. We have Mike Waltz. We have Keith Kellogg talking about cranking up the pressure on the Russians, even, as I said, as this argument plays out in Washington. And the Russians, of course, are aware of everything, and they're listening to everything. And over the last 24 hours, they've been responding. Now, the first response came from from Peskov, Putin's spokesman. And Peskov again reiterated that so far there have been no substantive discussions about Ukraine between Russia and the United States. What he said was, and this has been widely misrepresented by the way, what he said was that there have been renewed contacts, there's been discussions between the Americans and the Russians. But these discussions have involved specific agencies, and that these discussions involve a more active dialogue than had been the case during Biden's time. Well, of course, that can mean much, or it can mean very little. There was essentially no dialogue at all between the United States and Russia during Biden's time. So if there are contacts between specific agencies, well, a small amount of dialogue would still be an awful lot more dialogue than the zero dialogue that was taking place whilst Biden, Blinken and Sullivan were in charge. But what I think that Peskov is saying is that, in fact, there have been some contacts between the Americans and the Russians, even if these have not developed into any proper discussion or dialogue about Ukraine, that various agencies of the two governments are now gradually starting to re-establish contacts with each other. And I'm going to suggest what those agencies might be. Firstly, the intelligence agencies. John Radcliffe is now director of the CIA. He is able, therefore, to make executive decisions. The CIA has had regular contacts in the past with the Russian intelligence community, specifically with the SVR, headed by Sergei Narishkin. Narishkin recently spoke about his willingness to have a meeting with Radcliffe if that were desired by the American side. And I suspect that those intelligence contacts have resumed. By the way, in one of his many recent interviews and conversations, Zelensky himself has said that the Americans and the Russians always maintained a degree of contact with each other through the various intelligence agencies. Ukraine was excluded from that dialogue, and I suspect that some levels of contacts did exist, and it's quite likely that since John Radcliffe became director of the CIA, those contacts have increased. And I'm going to make a further guess that there's also been some contacts, at least now, between the US and Russian militaries again. We've not had any reports about this, neither the Russian Defense Ministry nor the Department of Defense in Washington have published any reports of conversations between the defense ministers, Belousov and Hegseth, or the military chiefs, Brown and Gerasimov. I'm going to guess, by the way, that Brown is not going to be chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for very long anyway. I would have thought that Pete Hegseth would probably want to replace him with someone else. So anyway, we haven't had any reports of contacts between the militaries at that high level, though they have sporadically happened previously during the Ukraine conflict. But I would not be surprised if some level of direct contacts between military attaches in Washington and Moscow and the relevant defense departments might have resumed, and we shall see. Anyway, I think that Peskov's comments about there being more active discussions between agencies is important and interesting. It does seem as if dialogue between the American and Russian governments is coming out of the long hibernation of the Biden era. But I don't think one should, for the moment, read too much into this. I don't get the sense, for example, that so far there's been direct contact between the national security advisors, Shoigu and Waltz, or of course the foreign ministers, Rubio and Lavrov. And of course, we have had no word of any conversation so far between Putin and Trump. Anyway, that was one thing that Peskov said. Peskov did say something else as well, and I just wanted to go back and clarify a little what he did say, which is that Peskov yesterday talked about Zelensky's latest comments about Ukraine being provided with long-range missiles and nuclear weapons and having Western troops on its territory if it could not enter NATO. Well, Peskov said that this approached madness, but he did also say that the Russians, nonetheless, are open to negotiations with Ukraine. And some people have read that as a change of stance. It is not. The Russians have always said at all times that they're prepared to have discussions with the Ukrainians, even whilst the leadership in Ukraine, the authority, the de facto authority in Ukraine remains Zelensky. Recently, for example, in one of his interviews with Pavel Zarubin, Putin himself said that he's fully prepared if there's moves towards negotiations, serious moves towards negotiations by the Ukrainians. Putin is prepared to appoint negotiators and to meet with Ukrainian negotiators and to explore ways forward. But Putin said, and Peskov has just reiterated, that there are significant legal obstacles to any of this. First of all, the Ukrainians must clarify their own position, given Zelensky's 2nd October 2022 decree prohibiting negotiations. And then there is still the unresolved question of Zelensky's legal status, which, as Putin has said, and as Peskov effectively reiterated, calls into question Zelensky's ability to sign off on any agreement. So I don't think this part of Peskov's comments really changes substantively anything at all. But other Russians have been speaking, and they have been speaking more interestingly about the prospect of negotiations. And these are the two, perhaps one could almost say the two most important people in the Russian foreign ministry. One, of course, being the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and the other being the deputy foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov. And bear in mind that if there are going to be negotiations between the Americans and the Russians, I expect Ryabkov to be Moscow's lead negotiator on issues between Russia and the United States, including issues relating to Ukraine. Now, I'm going to start with Lavrov because Lavrov is the more senior official, even though in some respects Ryabkov's comments were even more interesting. But anyway, Lavrov has spoken, And it's interesting to say that he did make comments in a roundtable meeting with 95 ambassadors in Moscow discussing Ukrainian issues. He did say a number of actually rather conciliatory things about the United States and about Donald Trump. And I'm going to read them. They're all set out now very quickly. The Russian Foreign Ministry has provided translations of his comments and has done so very fast. He says at the last round table, which is the last occasion when there were discussions previously about these issues in Moscow with the ambassadors, we talked about the need to look at the root causes of any conflict, as President Xi Jinping of China called for as part of his global security initiative. If any conflict is to be resolved, it should be studied in the context of its root causes before practical steps can be developed to remove them. The root cause of the Ukrainian conflict is that the West has purposefully sought for years, not just sought, but made effective steps to create direct military threats to the Russian Federation right on our borders, on the territory of Ukraine, drawing the country into NATO. We have repeatedly pointed this out, warned and demanded that the alliance show it was making good on its pledge not to expand eastward as far as to the former Soviet borders, now the Russian Federation's borders. It was to no avail. Suddenly, for the first time, President Trump said bluntly in one of his first speeches, criticizing the Biden administration's handling of the Ukraine crisis, that one of its biggest mistakes was insisting on NATO membership for Ukraine. He said if he had been president, this would never have happened and there would have been no conflict. For the first time, I would like to draw your attention to this fact. A Western leader, not just any Western leader, but the leader of the United States, who is in fact the leader of the entire Western world, uttered these words, which we welcome. For the first time, the NATO problem was designated as something that the United States is ready to discuss in earnest. Clearly, the United States is the one to decide on the Western approach and accordingly Kiev's stance on this issue. So far, so good. The Russians have registered Donald Trump's words about the fact that it was a mistake to hold out to Ukraine the possibility of NATO membership and insist on it in discussions with the Russians. I said when Trump said those things that this was a revolutionary statement coming from a Western leader and especially from the President of the United States. And here we see the Russians, Lavrov himself, acknowledging this fact. And then, of course, Lavrov goes on and he discusses the many problems. As the West has done before, let me remind you that in our previous encounters with the Biden administration, with representatives of France, Germany or other countries, even before the special military operation, when we made official proposals on security guarantees for everyone, including Ukraine and for Russia, of course, we were told that this was none of our business. I spoke personally with Antony Blinken in January 2022. He told me bluntly that it is none of our business and no one was to poke their noses into NATO's relationships with the countries that they want to have as members. And by the way, just to gloss that, Lavrov has gone further in previous comments. He has said that over the course of that discussion with Blinken in January 2022, Blinken told Lavrov that the United States, contrary to previous assurances given to Putin by Biden, that the United States and NATO reserved to themselves the right to establish missile bases in Ukraine once Ukraine joined NATO, and it was not Russia's business to query that fact. Anyway, Lavrov goes on to say, as the West has done before, they dismissed our reminders about their earlier political commitments under the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to ensure indivisible security. And then he goes on to complain that the Western powers repeatedly walk away from Security Council resolutions. Security Council resolutions, which form part of the web of international law, are simply ignored by the Western powers whenever it suits them. The phenomenon of cancel culture has manifested itself in the annulment of Security Council resolutions, including the Security Council resolution that endorsed the Minsk agreements. That was the one that was passed on the 2nd of March 2015, which confirmed and validated the Minsk agreement of 2015 and basically enshrined it in international law. And Lavrov goes on to say this is by no means a unique Ukrainian method of action employed by our Western colleagues. Cancellation of international law is now particularly evident concerning the situation in the Middle East. Decisions of the Security Council, which just a month or a month and a half ago were recognized by all without exception as a necessary foundation for actions to establish a Palestinian state, have simply been cancelled. President Trump announced that all residents should be removed from the Gaza Strip. He implied that Jordan and Egypt have plenty of land and suggested they settle these 1.5 to 2 million people there, while the United States would turn the Gaza Strip into a resort. This follows other decisions made by President Trump during his first term, such as the recognition of the Golan Heights as Israeli territory. Meanwhile, UN General Assembly and Security Council adopted different resolutions. These resolutions have been cancelled. There are many such examples, including Security Council resolutions related to Western Sahara. In our assessment, this trend will only increase. I am not lamenting this. I am stating the reality. Of course, diplomats must primarily consider the facts on the ground, which should be the subject of negotiations. So what Lavrov is here is saying, we note what Donald Trump has said. Conceptually, it is a breakthrough. He accepts that NATO membership for Ukraine is the root cause of the problem. But how can we nonetheless come to an agreement with the Americans or the Ukrainians on this topic when both the Ukrainians and the Americans show repeatedly that they are prepared to walk away from Security Council resolutions or treaty obligations whenever it suits them? So they just ignored the fact that there's a Security Council resolution that enshrined the Minsk agreement into international law. They ignore the fact that there have been any number of Security Council resolutions relating to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. They ignore the fact that there have been other Security Council resolutions on other issues like Western Sahara. Donald Trump is as much guilty of this as anyone else. So how can we in light of that, go ahead and agree to negotiations. It makes the whole process impossible. And Lavrov then went into a huge amount of details about how all kinds of obligations and commitments that the West has made on human rights and other issues, specifically with respect to Ukraine, have been ignored or cancelled, and how there's been no investigations, no proper investigations of things like the Odessa fire of May 2nd, 2024, about the origins of the Maidan events of May 2nd, 2014. The Odessa fire of May 2nd, 2014. There's been no examination of the February 2014 seizure of power in Kiev. None of those things. So how are the Russians going to be able to move forward with negotiations, given that they were in effect taking place in a legal vacuum? So Lavrov, in some respects, is being conciliatory. He says, we hear Donald Trump. We note that he has finally acknowledged that NATO is the core problem. But we are also fully aware that whatever agreements we enter into with the United States, in the future, the United States, as it has shown on many previous occasions, and not just the United States, the entire West, and of course Ukraine, might simply choose to walk away from them. And this now brings me to the other important Russian official who has spoken, and this is Sergei Ryabkov, the Deputy Foreign Minister. Now, Ryabkov was asked a question, and this is clearly a planted question, about the fact that there is no Russian ambassador in Washington and there is no American ambassador in Moscow. And again, Ryabkov was actually fairly conciliatory about this. He said that there's a complicated process in the United States before ambassadors are appointed, that Donald Trump is only in the process now of forming his administration, obviously agreeing to the accreditation of a Russian ambassador and the appointment of an American ambassador in Moscow is not a priority, and we shouldn't get too fussed or bothered by all of this. No doubt in time the Americans will come round and will deal with all of this, and all of this will be unblocked. But then Ryabkov went on to say this: any fuss over that matter, that's to say the non-appointment of ambassadors, or calls for falling into the arms of the new administration, are counterproductive and are based on the wrong assumption of the importance of coming to terms with the new team in the White House at all costs. The President of Russia has stated that we want a fair partnership with the West, which turned a deaf ear to that idea. Moreover, they never intended to listen to us because their goal has always been to maximally weaken their geopolitical rival by making use of the Soviet leadership's political myopia. Russia has stood its ground and regained its place in global geopolitics, disrupting the Biden administration's plan to promote a liberal rules-based order throughout the world and to inflict a strategic defeat on Moscow in the hybrid war to the last Ukrainian. In light of that policy's failure and the presidential transition, It is the United States that should take the first step towards normalizing bilateral relations, meaning through talks based on the principles of mutual respect and equality. We are open to dialogue and we are ready for hardcore negotiations with due regard for the realities on the ground and our national interests based on history and geography. So it is for Donald Trump and his team to decide and make a choice. Now, these are very strong words. What Ryabkov is saying is that Russia did not create the crisis in international relations. The crisis in international relations was caused by the fact that the Americans and the Western powers took advantage of the collapse of the Soviet Union to go back on all the agreements that they'd made with the Soviet leadership in the Gorbachev era, commitments not to expand NATO eastwards, that they pursued an aggressive and hostile policy towards Russia, that Russia has successfully pushed back, that the attempt to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia has been a failure, that the Russians are not going to retreat from that. They're not going to accept further assurances or give up the gains, the geopolitical gains, as well as the gains on the ground in Ukraine that they have made. That if there is going to be a dialogue with the Americans, it must be a dialogue based on equality and mutual respect. And bear in mind that the United States has always had difficulties negotiating with third parties on a basis of equality. And of course, it might be particularly difficult for some people in the United States to acknowledge that negotiations with Russia must be conducted on a basis of equality. And that the Russians are going to take a tough stance in negotiations and will defend their national interests and will do so based on the realities on the ground and also based on history and geography. And the last two words, history and geography, are very crucial as well, because which history is Ryabkov referring to? I've already discussed how Russian officials, including Putin himself, have increasingly begun to speak of Novorossiya, which of course extended historically well beyond the four regions. History and geography might say, for example, that Odessa and Nikolaev are also Russian cities, and perhaps they should be acknowledged as such. Just saying. I don't know, but it looks as if, taken together, if one looks at Lavrov and Ryabkov's comments, that yes, the Russians are prepared to discuss matters in Ukraine, with the Americans and with the Ukrainians as well, but far from being in any mood to make concessions, significant concessions. They're warning against the wrong assumption of the importance of coming to terms with the new team in the White House at all costs. Those are Ryabkov's words. They will insist on what they see as their interests, and if the Americans don't like that, so be it. The Russians will absorb whatever the Americans might try and throw at them. They've shown repeatedly that they can, and they will continue the special military operation, as they repeatedly say, until all its objectives have been achieved. Now, again, some people in Washington, the people who are saying that this has gone as far as it can go, the Ukraine conflict has gone as far as it can go, the United States needs to start taking decisions to cut down now, to extricate the United States from what is happening now. That faction, I think, have understood this. They've understood the Russian stance. Mike Waltz and Keith Kellogg, it seems, have not. They're going to have, I suspect, some bruising encounters with the Russians before very long. Kellogg certainly is. And, well, we will see what Donald Trump ultimately decides. As Ryabkov says, it is for Donald Trump, it is and his team to decide and make a choice. The Russians have set out their position. It is for the Americans to move towards it. Something which, again, historically and conceptually, the Americans find extremely difficult to do. So there we are. Negotiations are going to take place at some point. In 2 weeks' time, Kellogg is going to unveil his plan. He appears to think that he's got all the time in the world to do that. He's then going to go to Kiev. We'll see what kind of response Zelensky is going to put together. I suspect Zelensky is going to say lots of different things, all of which contradict each other. And as some people in the West like to do, the Americans, or at least Kellogg, will cherry pick on the favorable ones and ignore the contradictory ones, though the Russians, of course, will have a different perspective completely. And then I presume that Kellogg will go to Moscow, and there he will meet Ryabkov or someone else. And as I said, I expect that's going to be a tough and bruising encounter. And whether we're going to get a conversation between Trump and Putin in the meantime, and whether we're even going to get a summit meeting between Trump and Putin in the meantime, well, we'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, there we are. The Russians, as I said, have again set out their position. I think that this is as good a moment as any, once again, to return to the topic of the war. Now, a couple of days ago, Zelensky and Syrsky sacked General Gnatov, the former Ukrainian ground forces commander, and appointed in his place a new general, General Drapati. This has been happening on a regular basis recently. There's been a constant rotation of Ukrainian generals as each one fails, which of course they do. Given the realities on the ground, it could not be otherwise. Someone new is appointed to take their place. And General Drapati has been appointed, and as invariably happens when a new Ukrainian commander is appointed, he is appointed with orders from Zelensky specifically, passed on no doubt by Syrsky, to conduct counterattacks. And we have been seeing over the last couple of days a series of Ukrainian counterattacks. Now, as always, Zelensky's obsession remains Kursk region. And over the last 24 hours, there have been 2 Ukrainian counterattacks, one southeast of Sudzha towards the village of Cherkasskaya Konopelka, and another counterattack towards, in the direction or in the area of the village of Malaya Loknia. The word from the Russians for the moment is both is that both of these counterattacks have been unsuccessful, and that the Russians in the meantime are pressing forward, storming the village of Cherkasskaya, Porechnoye, which lies immediately to the south of Ruskaya Porechnoye, which the Russians captured about a week ago, with the Russians also now making an attempt to capture the village of Martinovka, which lies on the main road from Sudzha to Kursk. So anyway, there's a counterattack of some kind being carried out by the Ukrainians in Kursk region. And over the last couple of days, since General Drapati was appointed, the Ukrainians have been trying to conduct counterattacks in the Pokrovsk region, and they've been providing all kinds of videos showing Ukrainian armored vehicles trundling across the landscape towards villages of Kotlino and Pyshanye near Pokrovsk. And well, most of these videos, some of which are also produced by the Russians, show these vehicles being destroyed, and the Ukrainians have been making claims that they've regained the old building and whatever. And for all I know, that might be true. Now, whenever this happens, whenever a new general is appointed and counterattacks of this kind take place, the counterattacks provoke a certain excitement on the Ukrainian part of the internet for a while. And then, of course, whatever gains they've achieved proved ephemeral, and it becomes clear that the lives of men and machines have been thrown away to no useful purpose, that the Russians have prepared themselves for these counterattacks, and that they're too strong for these counterattacks to succeed in any meaningful way, and the defense lines are weakened, and then the Russians are able to advance and advance more quickly. This has happened in recent battles in Kursk region, and I've no doubt that it will happen again. It will happen also in the area of Pokrovsk. A group of forces north have again reiterated that they now control almost the entire area of Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, including the former citadel area, the area of the high-rise buildings. They say that Ukrainian commanders in the area are deceiving Zelensky about this. They're conducting counterattacks. They're trying to send men across the Volcha River to try to maintain the fiction that fighting is still continuing in the area of the high-rise buildings and north of Volchansk. And I suspect that that is right, and I suspect that we're seeing something fairly similar taking place in the Pokrovsk and Kursk areas as well. In other words, these counterattacks, like the previous ones in Toretsk, are being carried out not just as public relations events, but as a response by Ukrainian commanders on the ground to continuous pressure from Zelensky and perhaps Syrskyi to show results on the battlefield by conducting counterattacks. And the counterattacks in Toretsk clearly achieved nothing. I suspect the counterattacks in Kursk that we're seeing now will achieve nothing. The counterattack in Volchansk, according to Group of Forces North, is achieving nothing as well. And Russian bloggers and reporting channels are saying that the counterattacks in Kotlino and Pyshanye near Pokrovsk are also achieving nothing as well. Everywhere else, the Russians continue to advance. There's reports that they've captured the village of Dachnia, finally, south of Kurakovo, that they now control roughly 40% of the large village of Andreevka, which is the most important village in the Andreevka, Konstantinopol, Orakli fortified area. The Russians apparently continue their advance north of Vozdvizhenka. The Russians have now resumed, apparently, some kind of advance north of Toretsk, which suggests that whatever territory in Toretsk the Ukrainians briefly reoccupied has passed fully under Russian control again. And the Russians have apparently also gained further ground in Chasiv Yar. I've seen a suggestion that Chasiv Yar will fall completely under Russian control sometime in March. Quite plausibly, that will be the case. And most importantly, it seems that the Russians have significantly expanded now. Further expanded now their bridgeheads across the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. In fact, these bridgeheads are now becoming so big that I don't think one can even talk about them as bridgeheads anymore. Rather, one should say that the front lines have moved beyond the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, that these are no longer barriers in any meaningful sense anymore. There are still Ukrainian troops located east of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers in a number of places, like eastern Kupiansk, for example. But these remnants are basically holdouts. The major battle has moved beyond these two rivers, and as the Russians sort out their logistics, they will advance more rapidly. And I've been told, I've had a number of reports from this part of the world, that one of the major reason why there's been a slowdown in the fighting, which there has been to some extent, has been that the weather conditions have been unseasonably bad throughout this whole territory, that the ground has been extremely muddy and soft. There have been repeated thaws. The skies have been overcast, which has interfered with the operations of the Russian Air Force. But over the next couple of weeks, a period of much colder weather and clear skies is coming. And at that point, especially with the logistics sorted out, the Russian advances are expected to resume. Well, of course, they've been happening in some places already, but that they're going to accelerate. That may very well be true. We shall just have to wait and see. To repeat again, I am not there, so I can't be sure. But I think that is probably true. Now, I've received, now this is where I'm going to finish today's program, some claims, again, about the presence of the North Korean troops in Kursk region. I've discussed how these North Korean troops, there was never any real proof that they were actually on location. And now when it's become inconvenient, the reports in the West say that the North Korean troops have been withdrawn without ever providing any tangible proof of their existence. Well, a number of people have written to me about some videos that the Ukrainians published in the middle of January, purporting to show two North Korean soldiers who had been allegedly captured by the Ukrainians in Kursk region and who appeared to be going through interrogations. I've seen those videos. One of them looks very blurry to me. Neither video has been independently corroborated. I understand that the various agencies have not had encounters with these particular prisoners. And as an article that appeared recently in Responsible Statecraft pointed out, there are difficulties with the timing of these videos, because if one accepts the claims about when these Ukrainian troops were captured, it appears to correspond with the period when other reports say the North Korean soldiers were being withdrawn. Now, again, I've obviously not met these soldiers, but I just don't think that these videos amount to the evidence of the presence of North Korean troops in Kursk region that people are saying. There's been so much evidence provided by the Ukrainians of the presence of the North Koreans that has turned out to be wrong or false, that I really can't accept this evidence either. And notice that we haven't heard about these two North Korean soldiers now for almost a month. So, I repeat again, it looks to me as if the North Koreans came and went and probably were never there in the first place. And that's really all I'm going to say, or expect to say, about this affair. So this is where I end today's video. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.